In an age when the world seemed to belong only to men, when thrones and temples, libraries and battlefields were dominated by their voices, there emerged in the great city of Alexandria a woman whose mind outshone them all. Her name was Hypatia, and she was no ordinary teacher, no silent scribe hidden in the shadows. She was the greatest mathematician of her time, the unrivaled scholar whose brilliance bridged the dying light of classical Greece with the uncertain dawn of the medieval world. While kingdoms crumbled and empires fell into dust, Hypatia drew circles upon parchment that revealed eternal truths, charted the heavens with instruments of reason, and spoke with the authority of numbers in an age when numbers were closer to divinity than science. She was celebrated, revered, even feared, not because she wielded armies, but because she wielded knowledge, and knowledge was power. Yet the very gift that made her immortal in history would also make her a target. For in the turbulent streets of Alexandria, wisdom could be mistaken for sorcery, and a woman who solved the mysteries of the stars could be branded more dangerous than any sword. The city of Alexandria, where Hypatia was born, was no ordinary city. Founded by Alexander the Great centuries earlier, it had once been the beating heart of Hellenistic civilization. Its lighthouse, the Pharos, stood among the wonders of the world, guiding ships from distant lands into its bustling harbors. Its famed library, though already scarred by centuries of neglect and destruction, still echoed with the memory of countless scrolls that once held the wisdom of the ancients. Here East met West, Greek philosophers debated with Egyptian priests, Roman governors ruled with iron authority, and traders from India and Arabia brought spices, jewels, and stories from beyond the known horizon. Into this vibrant crossroads of culture and conflict, Hypatia entered the world, destined to leave her mark. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was himself a man of knowledge, a mathematician, and astronomer devoted to the preservation of Greek science in a world increasingly hostile to it. He recognized early that his daughter possessed not only curiosity but genius. Where most young girls of Alexandria were taught to manage households, weave cloth, and prepare for marriage, Hypatia was guided to the study of the heavens, the geometry of Euclid, and the numerical riddles of Diophantus. By lamplight, she listened as her father explained the harmony of the cosmos, the logic of numbers, and the geometry that underpinned the universe itself. To Theon, she was not merely a daughter, but an heir to the fading but still radiant glory of Greek reason. As she grew, Hypatia's presence began to astonish all who encountered her. She moved with a dignity that made men twice her age bow their heads. Yet she carried no crown. Her beauty, often remarked upon by later historians, was said to be striking. But it was not her face that held her audience captive. It was her voice, clear, commanding, and filled with conviction. When she spoke of mathematics, her words wove a spell more powerful than any incantation. When she explained the motions of the planets, her listeners felt that they themselves had touched the heavens. And when she walked through the streets of Alexandria, cloaked not in jewels but in the robes of a philosopher, the people saw in her a living embodiment of wisdom. But Alexandria, in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, was no safe haven for a woman of such brilliance. The empire was changing. Christianity, once persecuted, had become the dominant faith of Rome, and with it came a tidal wave of transformation that threatened to sweep away the remnants of pagan philosophy. The city that had once welcomed debate now burned with fanaticism. Pagans, Jews, and Christians clashed in bloody riots. Bishops rivaled governors for power. The streets, once filled with scholars and merchants, became arenas of political and religious struggle. In this storm, Hypatia's very existence became a symbol. To some, she represented the noble heritage of Greek learning, a last guardian of the wisdom of Plato and Aristotle. To others, she was the embodiment of the old gods, a dangerous reminder of a world Christianity sought to extinguish. Still, Hypatia persevered. She became the head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria, a position of immense prestige and danger. There, she taught not only mathematics and astronomy, but also philosophy, the pursuit of truth through reason. Her classroom was a sanctuary for the brightest minds of the empire. Students traveled from distant lands to sit at her feet. Among them were future bishops, governors, and philosophers who would carry her influence far beyond the city's walls. She taught them that the universe was ordered, that reason was divine, and that mathematics was the language through which one might glimpse eternity. For Hypatia, numbers were not merely symbols on parchment, they were the keys to understanding the very soul of existence. But outside her classroom, forces gathered. The Christian bishop Cyril sought to consolidate power over Alexandria, and in Hypatia he saw an obstacle. Her friendship with Orestes, the imperial governor who resisted Cyril's growing authority, marked her as a political enemy. Whispers spread among the faithful that she was a sorceress, that her calculations were spells, that her beauty and eloquence were tools of seduction used to corrupt men's souls. In a world where fear outweighed reason, superstition could outweigh truth. The stage was set for tragedy. Her death, when it came, was not merely the murder of a woman, but the symbolic execution of philosophy itself. In the March of 415, a mob dragged her from her chariot, tore her clothes from her body, and slaughtered her with shards of pottery. The woman who had charted the stars and unveiled the mysteries of mathematics was reduced to silence by brutality. The city that once crowned her with honor became the stage of her destruction. Yet even in death, she could not be silenced. Her legacy would live on, whispered in the corridors of medieval monasteries, revived in the courts of Renaissance scholars, and remembered in the modern age as the voice of reason crushed by the fist of fanaticism. And so the story of Hypatia begins at once luminous and tragic, a tale of knowledge, power, faith, and betrayal. To tell her story is to confront the question of whether humanity can ever truly honor wisdom, or whether the light of reason must always fight against the shadows of fear. From her earliest days, Hypatia's life was surrounded not by toys and lullabies, but by scrolls and instruments of science. Her father, Theon, believed that the human mind was a temple more enduring than any shrine of marble, and he sought to build in his daughter a sanctuary of reason that no mob could burn and no empire could collapse. While other children played in the courtyards of Alexandria, Hypatia sat at her father's side as he copied manuscripts of Euclid and Ptolemy, guiding her hand to trace the perfect lines of geometry. Numbers became her first language, constellations her first map, and philosophy her first creed. She was trained to sharpen her intellect as a warrior sharpens his sword, with the discipline of long hours spent studying proofs, observing the stars, and debating the nature of truth itself. Theon was no ordinary tutor. He was one of the last great scholars attached to the Library and Museum of Alexandria, institutions already fading from their former glory. Yet he knew that his work could survive if entrusted to a worthy heir, and Hypatia proved herself more than worthy. He taught her not merely to repeat, but to question, not merely to memorize, but to penetrate to the heart of an argument. Each evening, as the oil lamps flickered against parchment and papyrus, father and daughter engaged in conversations that few households in the empire could imagine. The structure of conic sections, the errors in astronomical tables, the logical puzzles of Aristotle, the harmony of Plato's forms, Hypatia absorbed these teachings not with passive obedience, but with an eager hunger that startled even her father. As she grew into womanhood, her education expanded beyond mathematics and astronomy. Theon believed that the pursuit of wisdom required balance between body and mind. He introduced her to physical training instructing her in the discipline of walking long distances under the sun, swimming against the currents near the harbor, and practicing exercises to strengthen her endurance. A philosopher, he taught her, must not only reason with clarity, but also endure the hardships of life without faltering. Thus Hypatia became not only a mind of astonishing brilliance, but also a presence of remarkable strength and poise, capable of commanding respect in a society that seldom listened to women. In the heart of Alexandria, her reputation began to spread. Students who once sought Theon's guidance now found themselves captivated by his daughter's clarity of explanation. She could take the most abstract proposition and weave it into words that lit the imagination. Mathematics, under her guidance, became not a cold chain of numbers, but a living music, an eternal harmony between the human mind and the cosmos. She taught that numbers revealed the divine order hidden within the apparent chaos of life. To listen to her was to believe, if only for a moment, that the world itself was rational and knowable. Word of this remarkable woman traveled quickly through the city. Alexandria was a place of constant movement, its docks alive with traders and scholars from Rome, Athens, Antioch, and beyond. Among them, tales of Hypatia spread like fire, of her eloquence, her beauty, her serenity, and above all, her fearless commitment to reason. Unlike most women of her age, she refused to marry. When questioned, she responded that she was already wedded to truth. This choice, radical in her society, gave her both independence and authority. It set her apart as a philosopher of a different kind, one who lived by principle rather than convention. Her lectures soon attracted not only students but leaders, men of influence who recognized the value of her wisdom. Governors, judges, and future bishops came to sit in her classroom, eager to hear a woman speak with the authority of the ancients. To them, she became not merely a teacher, but an oracle of reason in a world slipping into superstition. In her presence, men accustomed to ruling cities and provinces listened as disciples. They did not see in her a rival, but a guide, someone who could reveal to them a higher vision of order and justice. But this growing fame did not come without cost. For every admirer, there were those who whispered against her. Some muttered that a woman so learned could not be natural, that her knowledge came from hidden powers, that her beauty and brilliance concealed sorcery. In a city increasingly divided along religious lines, where Christians and pagans accused one another of witchcraft and idolatry, such suspicions were dangerous. Hypatia, however, remained undeterred. She walked through the streets in the philosopher's cloak, a garment traditionally reserved for men, and she bore it with such dignity that even her detractors hesitated to speak against her openly. To her students, she offered not only lessons in mathematics and astronomy, but also a vision of life itself. She taught them that philosophy was a way of being, a discipline of the soul. To live philosophically was to seek harmony with the cosmos, to embrace reason even in the face of chaos, and to love truth more than life itself. This teaching became the heart of her legacy, shaping those who would carry her name long after her voice was silenced. It was during these years that she produced works which, though largely lost to time, left their mark on generations. She edited and commented on Diophantus's Arithmetica, clarifying complex problems of algebra that later influenced Islamic and European mathematicians. She worked on the conics of Apollonius, illuminating the study of curves that would one day help unlock the secrets of planetary motion. With her father, she contributed to the preservation of Ptolemy's Almagest, ensuring that the knowledge of the heavens would not vanish in the storm of empire's decline. Each page she touched was an act of defiance against oblivion, a declaration that reason would endure even as kingdoms fell. Her fame grew so great that she was often seen riding through Alexandria in her chariot, an image that startled many of her contemporaries. For a woman to move so freely, commanding attention without shame, was unheard of. Yet Hypatia was no ordinary woman. She represented the last great flame of Hellenic philosophy, a beacon in an age when the light was dimming. Crowds would part as she passed, some in awe, others in resentment, but none indifferent. Her very presence was a challenge to the boundaries of her time. Yet beneath the admiration, the city trembled with tensions that would soon consume her. The Roman Empire was no longer the world-spanning power it once had been. In the west, barbarians pressed against the borders. In the east, Constantinople rose as the new capital of imperial authority. Alexandria, though still wealthy, became a battleground of ideas and faiths. The old gods of Greece and Egypt had not vanished, but the new religion of Christianity sought to uproot them entirely. In this struggle, Hypatia, pagan, philosopher, and mathematician, would find herself caught between powers greater than any equation could solve. The streets of Alexandria echoed with the chants of rival faiths, each faction claiming the city as its own. The Jews had long thrived in Alexandria, with synagogues that rivaled temples in their grandeur. The Christians, once scattered and persecuted, now filled the city with their hymns, their bishops wielding power equal to that of Roman governors. The pagans, adherents of the old gods and the philosophies of Greece, still clung to their rituals and traditions, unwilling to surrender to the new tide. In this divided world, Hypatia walked a perilous path. Though she belonged to no faction, her role as philosopher made her a symbol of the old intellectual order, one that many believed stood in the way of Christian dominance. It was in this climate that two powerful men rose to prominence in Alexandria, and Hypatia's fate would become inseparably bound to theirs. The first was Orestes, the imperial governor appointed by the emperor to keep the city under control. A man of Roman law and authority, he found in Hypatia not only an intellectual companion, but also a trusted advisor. Her wisdom, her clarity of thought, her ability to mediate disputes made her invaluable to him. She was not a politician, yet her counsel influenced the course of politics itself. Orestes admired her, perhaps even revered her, and relied on her as a source of reason in a city descending into chaos. The second man was Cyril, the Christian bishop of Alexandria, a figure both charismatic and ruthless. To his followers, he was a holy shepherd protecting his flock from the snares of paganism and heresy. To his enemies, he was a tyrant cloaked in priestly robes, determined to dominate the city not only spiritually, but politically. Cyril saw in Orestes a rival for power, and in Hypatia an obstacle, an educated pagan woman whose influence over the governor threatened his authority. To undermine her was to weaken Orestes, and to weaken Orestes was to secure control over Alexandria itself. The rivalry between Orestes and Cyril grew sharper with each passing month. Riots broke out in the streets between Jews and Christians, pagans and Christians, each side blaming the other for bloodshed. Hypatia, known for her neutrality, sought to rise above the conflicts, but neutrality in such times was itself a dangerous position. Her classroom remained open to all Christians, Jews, and pagans alike, but this inclusiveness, once a testament to her greatness, was twisted into evidence of conspiracy. Whispers spread that she counseled Orestes against the church, that her pagan philosophy corrupted Christian youth, that her mathematical instruments were not tools of reason but devices of sorcery. She herself paid little attention to such rumors. Philosophy had taught her that envy and ignorance always hounded those who sought truth. Yet her enemies multiplied. Every public appearance, every lecture she gave, every moment she rode her chariot through the streets became an act of defiance to those who longed to see the city fully under ecclesiastical rule. To the mob, she was no longer just a teacher. She was a symbol of the pagan world, of resistance to the bishop's authority, of a past that the rising Christian order sought to erase, and still she taught. Her lectures on Plato and Aristotle inspired students to think beyond dogma, to question the nature of the cosmos and the soul. Her discussions on mathematics revealed the harmony of creation, not as a miracle to be accepted blindly, but as a structure to be understood through reason. To her, mathematics was not in opposition to faith, it was faith of another kind, faith in the orderliness of the universe. Yet her enemies did not see it so. In their eyes, a woman teaching men, a pagan guiding Christians, a philosopher advising governors, this was intolerable. The tension reached a breaking point when violence erupted between Orestes and the Christian faction. In one infamous incident, Orestes was attacked in the streets by a mob of Christian monks. He was beaten nearly to death before the citizens rallied to his defense. The episode humiliated Cyril, for it exposed the aggression of his followers, but it also deepened the enmity between him and the governor. Orestes, already despised by the bishop, now became his sworn enemy. In the center of this feud stood Hypatia, not because she sought power, but because she represented the mind behind Orestes' resistance. Rumors grew darker. They said she used her beauty to ensnare men, her mathematics to summon demons, her philosophy to poison Christian faith. The tools of her scholarship, the astrolabes, compasses, and charts, were described as instruments of black magic. Her presence in the governor's circle was painted as evidence of witchcraft. Slowly, methodically, the bishop's supporters built a narrative that the troubles of Alexandria were not the result of politics or poverty, but of a single woman who defied the natural order, a woman whose wisdom had become dangerous. For Hypatia, there was no retreat. To abandon philosophy would be to betray herself, to silence the voice of reason she had carried since childhood. And so she continued, knowing but not fearing that the storm was gathering. For in her heart she believed what she taught her students, that reason was divine, and that no darkness could ever extinguish it completely. But the darkness was coming. It gathered in the alleys and marketplaces, in the whispers of zealots, in the sermons that branded her a sorceress. It sharpened its knives not on arguments, but on hatred. And as the spring of 415 approached, the city that had once celebrated her would become the stage of her destruction. The spring air of Alexandria in the year 415 carried with it more than the fragrance of the harbor winds and the distant cries of merchants. It carried whispers that echoed through taverns, markets, and churches, whispers of vengeance and blood. The name on every tongue was Hypatia. Some spoke it with admiration, others with resentment, and still others with a hatred so fierce that it burned hotter than any truth. Her fate was already sealed, though she did not know it. Or perhaps she did, and simply refused to let fear dictate her life. She continued her daily routine, rising with the sun, preparing her notes, and riding in her chariot to meet her students. To them, she was still the embodiment of wisdom, her calm voice a refuge in the storm of the city's conflicts. They gathered eagerly in her lectures, scribbling her words, marveling at her clarity. Yet, even as they listened, the streets outside grew darker, filled with zealots who no longer saw her as a philosopher, but as the source of all unrest, a pagan witch who bewitched the governor and stood in the way of God's kingdom. One day, as her chariot clattered over the stones of Alexandria's streets, the mob was waiting. Drawn from the ranks of the Parabolani, a group of fanatical monks loyal to Cyril, they watched her approach with eyes burning with fury. She was alone, unarmed, unguarded, for Hypatia had never believed that reason required a shield. To her, the philosopher's cloak was protection enough, the dignity of her calling stronger than any sword. But the mob did not see dignity, they saw an enemy. They surged forward, pulling her from her chariot. The crowd screamed, a mix of zeal and frenzy, and dragged her through the streets like a trophy. Citizens watched in horror as the woman once revered as the jewel of Alexandria was beaten, stripped, and mocked. She was taken to a church, a cruel irony that her death should be staged in a place claimed as holy. There the mob fell upon her with stones and shards of pottery, tearing her flesh with jagged edges until her cries were silenced. The brilliant mind that had charted the heavens and illuminated the mysteries of mathematics was extinguished not by debate, not by reason, but by bloodlust. When her body lay broken, they dragged the remains through the streets and burned them, as though fire could consume memory itself. News of her death spread like wildfire through the empire. For some, it was a victory, a triumph of the faith over paganism, the cleansing of Alexandria from the stain of philosophy. For others, it was a tragedy so profound that words could barely contain it. The governor Orestes, powerless to protect her, was left broken in spirit, his authority diminished, his ally gone. The bishop Cyril, though never officially accused, carried the shadow of complicity. To later generations, his name would be tied forever to hers, his sainthood stained by the blood of a philosopher. Yet death did not end Hypatia's story. In truth, it only began another chapter, one written not on papyrus, but in the hearts of those who remembered. Her students carried her teachings far and wide, preserving fragments of her commentary, her ideas, her spirit. They whispered her name in distant lands, in Constantinople, in Athens, even in the courts of Europe centuries later when the Renaissance awakened the love of reason anew. She became a symbol, a martyr, not of a single faith, but of philosophy itself, of knowledge betrayed by ignorance, of wisdom silenced by fanaticism. Centuries later, chroniclers would write of her, some condemning, others praising. The Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, despite his faith, admitted that her death was a disgrace to the Church, an act of savagery that stained the name of Christ. Pagan writers saw her as the last flame of Hellenic learning, extinguished in the twilight of antiquity. Renaissance scholars resurrected her image as a heroine of reason, an inspiration for those who sought to reconcile science and faith. Modern thinkers embraced her as an icon of intellectual freedom, a woman ahead of her time, silenced by a world not ready to bear her brilliance. And still her figure rides through history, as vividly as she once rode her chariot through the streets of Alexandria. To some, she is the pagan sorceress, to others, the Christian martyr. But to all, she remains a question. What happens when society turns its rage against its brightest mind? Her death is more than a tale of one woman's fate. It is a mirror reflecting the eternal struggle between knowledge and ignorance, between freedom and oppression, between light and darkness. The city that betrayed her has long since crumbled, its lighthouse fallen, its library destroyed, its glory dimmed. But Hypatia's name endures. In classrooms, in books, in whispered stories of those who resist tyranny, she is remembered. Her life reminds us that wisdom is fragile, that progress is not inevitable, that the greatest danger to truth is not error, but fear. The shards of pottery that tore her flesh were not just weapons of a mob, they were symbols of a world willing to destroy what it could not understand. And yet, even in destruction, there is resilience. Hypatia lives on, not in her body, but in the minds she inspired, the legacy she left, the questions she raised. She is not only the first great female mathematician whose name history has preserved, but also a beacon of what humanity might achieve when courage meets intellect. Her death was a tragedy, but her memory is a triumph. For every time her story is told, the mob that sought to silence her fails, and the voice of Hypatia rises once more above the ruins of Alexandria, reminding us that the pursuit of truth is worth any price. The ashes of Hypatia's body scattered into the winds of Alexandria, but her spirit traveled further than the mob could have imagined. In the decades that followed her death, silence fell over the city's intellectual life. Scholars fled, the pagan temples declined, and philosophy withdrew into the hidden chambers of monasteries where Christian monks copied texts by candlelight. The very city that had once been the heart of Greek wisdom grew quieter, its grand library already diminished, its schools overshadowed by churches. Hypatia's voice, so clear and commanding in life, seemed to vanish into the shadows of history. And yet, memory has a way of surviving where bodies cannot. In the centuries of the Middle Ages, her name was spoken in whispers. Christian chroniclers, uneasy with the brutal manner of her death, struggled to explain it. Some condemned the violence outright, admitting that such savagery dishonored the very faith it claimed to defend. Others sought to minimize her influence, portraying her not as a philosopher of grandeur, but as a pagan whose time had passed. Yet even in their attempts to bury her, they preserved her name. To dismiss her was to acknowledge her, and in acknowledging her, they ensured she would never be forgotten. Meanwhile, fragments of her work endured in unexpected places. In the Islamic world, where scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba translated Greek texts into Arabic, the mathematical and astronomical writings she had touched found new life. Her commentaries on Diophantus and Apollonius, her revisions of Ptolemy, carried her intellectual fingerprints into lands far from Alexandria. Though her name was sometimes lost in the chain of transmission, her influence lived quietly, embedded in the knowledge that crossed deserts and seas. The very civilizations that Europe would later look to for the revival of science carried within them echoes of Hypatia's mind. In medieval Europe, where scholasticism dominated universities, Hypatia's name rarely appeared, but her spirit was present in the survival of Greek philosophy. The questions she asked, the methods she employed, the devotion to reason over dogma, these were seeds lying dormant, waiting for the right soil to sprout again. For nearly 1,000 years, the world slept in the shadow of forgotten brilliance, but the dawn would come. When the Renaissance arrived, it came with a hunger for lost knowledge. Scholars in Italy, France, and beyond scoured monasteries, libraries, and dusty archives for the treasures of antiquity. Among the names resurrected was Hypatia's. Suddenly the story of a woman philosopher from Alexandria who had been murdered for her wisdom captured the imagination of poets, artists, and thinkers. To them, she was not merely a historical figure, but a symbol of what the Renaissance itself sought: the rebirth of reason, the defiance of ignorance, the rediscovery of beauty in truth. Writers painted her as a martyr of philosophy, a tragic heroine whose death marked the fall of ancient wisdom and whose memory signaled its rebirth. Painters imagined her standing at the front of her classroom, draped in philosopher's robes, her students gazing in awe as she drew circles of eternity in the air. Poets described her as a woman of surpassing beauty, whose true power lay not in her face, but in her mind. To Renaissance humanists, she became a rallying figure, a reminder that knowledge was sacred and that those who sought it must sometimes defy the powers of their age. As Europe moved into the Enlightenment, Hypatia's reputation grew still greater. In an era when reason was raised as the highest virtue and superstition condemned as the enemy of progress, her death was retold as the ultimate parable. Philosophers such as Voltaire invoked her name, denouncing the brutality of religious fanaticism and holding her up as the victim of ignorance's worst crime. To the Enlightenment, Hypatia was not only a mathematician but a martyr of free thought itself. Her murder was framed as proof that the pursuit of knowledge was always at risk when shackled by dogma. By the 19th century, Hypatia's story had entered literature with renewed vigor. Charles Kingsley, the English novelist, wrote a romanticized tale of her life and death, portraying her as both a saintly teacher and a tragic victim. Though his work was shaped by the Victorian ideals of his time, it introduced her to a wider audience, embedding her image in Western imagination. Historians, scientists, and feminists alike found inspiration in her. To women fighting for the right to education, Hypatia was a patron saint of intellect, proof that a woman could not only rival men, but surpass them in the highest realms of thought. In the modern age, her legacy took on new dimensions. She became a symbol in the struggle between science and superstition, reason and fanaticism, freedom and oppression. Films and novels reimagined her, scholars studied her, and her name was spoken not with pity but with reverence. The 2009 film Agora introduced her to millions, dramatizing her final days and reigniting debates about the conflict between religion and science. Though dramatized, it reminded the world that Hypatia's story was not just history, but a mirror of timeless conflict. Even today, her name carries weight. In classrooms, she is remembered as the first great female mathematician recorded by history, a pioneer whose works laid stepping stones for centuries of discovery. To philosophers, she is a martyr of reason. To feminists, she is a symbol of courage against a world that sought to silence her. To historians, she is the bridge between ancient and medieval, pagan and Christian, philosophy and faith. Her life is studied not merely for what she taught, but for what her death revealed, that humanity's progress is fragile, that wisdom can be destroyed if we fail to defend it, and that every age must decide anew whether to honor knowledge or crucify it. Thus, the story of Hypatia stretches beyond the streets of Alexandria, beyond the smoke of her funeral pyre, beyond the centuries of silence. It is a story that belongs to every age that has ever wrestled with the tension between light and darkness, reason and fear. For as long as her name is spoken, Hypatia lives. Her death was not the end, but the beginning of a legacy that no mob could erase. And in that legacy lies a challenge to honor truth even when it is dangerous, to defend wisdom even when it is costly, and to remember always that the brightest flame is often the one most fiercely attacked by the shadows. Imagine the courtyard of the Alexandrian school where Hypatia taught. The marble colonnades glowed under the Mediterranean sun, their columns etched with centuries of dust and glory. Students from every corner of the empire gathered there, young men from Athens with eager eyes, sons of Roman officials in flowing togas, Christian youths hungry for philosophy, and even curious travelers from distant lands who had heard whispers of the woman philosopher who spoke with the voice of Plato. They sat on stone benches, wax tablets in hand, their hearts racing with anticipation. For when Hypatia entered, silence fell like a sacred hush. She appeared not in the silks of aristocracy, but in the philosopher's cloak, a simple garment that announced her devotion to reason above luxury. Her hair, often described as long and dark, framed a face both stern and radiant, a face that carried the dignity of wisdom rather than vanity. When she began to speak, her voice was steady, each word measured, as though she carved thoughts into the air with the precision of a sculptor shaping marble. Numbers, she would say, tracing shapes on a board or in the sand at her feet, are not inventions of man, but revelations of the divine order. They are eternal, unchanging, beyond the reach of corruption. To know them is to glimpse eternity. Her students leaned forward, captivated not only by the content, but by the conviction with which she spoke. In an age where superstition clashed with reason, her words offered certainty that the cosmos was not chaos but harmony, that the mind could, through effort, touch the infinite. She guided them through Euclid's geometry, showing how the perfect circle was not merely a shape, but a symbol of divine unity. She led them through the riddles of Diophantus, unraveling problems of algebra that left others confounded. She explained the motions of the planets, comparing their orbits to music, a symphony written across the heavens. And when she turned to philosophy, she invoked Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus, weaving their teachings into her own vision of a universe governed by reason and accessible through the discipline of thought. Among her students were men who would later carry influence across the empire. Synesius of Cyrene, one of her most famous pupils, went on to become a Christian bishop. In his letters he described his devotion to her, calling her the true guide to the mysteries of philosophy. Even when he took on the responsibilities of the church, he wrote to her for counsel, blending his faith with the wisdom he had received at her side. To him, and to many others, Hypatia was not merely a teacher, but a living embodiment of wisdom itself. Her classroom was more than a place of learning. It was a sanctuary, a space where philosophy still breathed in a world where it was being suffocated. Outside, the city roared with conflict. Riots flared between Christians and Jews. Pagan temples were stripped of their treasures. Statues of old gods toppled in the squares. But inside Hypatia's school, reason reigned. It was an island of calm in a sea of violence, a last echo of the Academy of Athens, transplanted to the shores of Egypt. Yet Hypatia was not blind to the dangers. She heard the whispers, saw the glances in the marketplace, felt the tension that wrapped around her city like a tightening noose. She knew that her presence defied expectation, that as a woman commanding men, she walked a path both revered and resented. Still, she refused to retreat. For her, philosophy was not a pastime, but a calling, one that demanded courage as much as intellect. To abandon her post would be to betray not only herself, but also the truth she had dedicated her life to serve. And so she continued, rising each morning to ride her chariot through the crowded streets. Children pointed, merchants paused, and even her detractors could not help but stare. She was a figure unlike any other, neither queen nor priestess, but something both greater and more threatening, a woman who wielded knowledge. Her presence was a reminder that power did not always come from armies or gold, but from the mind, and that such power could shape the destiny of nations. It was this power that drew Orestes to her. The Roman governor whose struggle with Bishop Cyril would define the fate of Alexandria. To him, Hypatia was not only an advisor, but an anchor of reason, someone who could steady him amidst the storms of politics. Their relationship, though never romantic, was a partnership of intellect, a rare alliance between philosophy and governance. In Hypatia's counsel, Orestes found guidance, and in Orestes' protection, Hypatia found the chance to continue her work. But this alliance was also her doom, for to Cyril and his followers it was proof that she stood in opposition to the church. As the conflict between Orestes and Cyril escalated, Hypatia's name became a weapon. Sermons condemned her, rumors vilified her, crowds cursed her as she passed. Her instruments of science, the astrolabes, the hydroscopes, the compasses, were denounced as tools of witchcraft. Her lectures were painted as corruptions of youth. To those who longed for a city ruled by one faith, her philosophy was poison. And yet she persisted, her voice unwavering, her chariot rolling through streets that grew more hostile with each passing day. Her students begged her to be cautious, to travel less, to keep her teachings within safer walls. But Hypatia refused. Philosophy, she told them, is not meant to hide in shadows. If truth cannot walk openly in the light, then we are already enslaved by falsehood. These words, remembered by those who loved her, became her epitaph, for within weeks the mob would prove her right. The city of Alexandria had always thrived on its contradictions, wealth and poverty, learning and ignorance, tolerance and violence, but in the spring of 415 its contradictions sharpened into blades. The harbor bustled as ships unloaded silks and spices, but in the alleys whispers turned to chants, and chants to rage. Markets rang with the cries of merchants, but beneath their calls simmered the tension of rival factions ready to erupt. Every temple, every church, every forum became a battleground for power. The ordinary citizens felt it in the air. A storm was coming, and at its center was the philosopher in the chariot. The name of Hypatia passed through the crowds, not as praise, but as accusation. The sorceress, they muttered, the pagan witch who blinds the governor with her spells. Each retelling grew darker, more grotesque. She was said to draw the moon from the sky, to cloud men's minds, to corrupt the faithful with her beauty. Her scrolls became grimoires, her instruments of learning became relics of witchcraft. It mattered little that none of it was true. Fear did not need truth, it needed only a target. Cyril, the bishop, never raised a hand himself. He did not need to. His sermons, his words, his silences were enough. His followers, the Parabolani fanatical monks who believed themselves soldiers of God, listened and obeyed. They roamed the streets, their black robes swaying like shadows, their chants echoing like war drums. To them, Hypatia was not a woman of wisdom, but the embodiment of evil. By destroying her, they believed, they would cleanse the city. Yet in her home, Hypatia prepared as she always did. Scrolls lay open across wooden tables, instruments gleamed in the morning light. She traced circles with her stylus, wrote numbers into neat columns, considered the harmony of equations that outlived human passions. To her, the turbulence of Alexandria was but noise against the eternal order of mathematics. She had lived her life in pursuit of reason, and she would not abandon it now. Her students urged her to stay inside, to let the city cool its anger, but Hypatia refused. If philosophy must hide, she told them, then philosophy is already defeated. She wrapped herself in her philosopher's cloak, stepped into her chariot, and set out. The wheels rattled over cobblestones, the horses' hooves struck sparks, and the people turned to look. Some bowed their heads in respect, others spat curses, but all eyes followed her. The mob struck quickly. Emerging from the alleys like wolves, they swarmed the chariot, dragging her to the ground. She did not scream. Accounts suggest she faced them with the calm dignity of a woman who knew that reason could not be killed, even if her body could. But the mob had no interest in dignity. They pulled her through the streets, her cloak torn, her hair matted with dust. The people watched, some in horror, some in silence, some with the cruel joy of those who believe they are righteous. They dragged her into a church, the very house of God, as though to make a spectacle of their triumph. There the frenzy reached its peak. Shards of pottery, ostraka, jagged fragments once used for simple writing, became their weapons. They tore into her flesh, slicing, ripping, until the marble floor was stained with blood. Her body, once the vessel of one of the greatest minds of antiquity, was reduced to fragments by hands that feared what they could not understand. When at last she was dead, they dragged her remains through the streets, scattering pieces as if to erase her from memory. Then they burned what was left, feeding flames with the body of philosophy itself. Silence followed, not the silence of peace, but the silence of shame. Even among Christians, there were those who recoiled at the horror. Socrates Scholasticus, the church historian, wrote that her murder brought no small opprobrium upon Cyril and the church of Alexandria. Yet no punishment came. The mob dispersed. The city continued. The governor Orestes weakened and alone. The bishop Cyril stronger than ever. Hypatia was gone, and with her the last great voice of Alexandria's golden age. But though the mob destroyed her body, they could not destroy her memory. In the minds of her students, her voice echoed. In the scrolls she had touched, her wisdom lingered. In the centuries to come, her death would be retold not as a victory for faith, but as a tragedy for humanity. Hypatia became more than a woman. She became a symbol, and symbols cannot be burned. The flames that consumed Hypatia's body in Alexandria did not consume her story. Instead, they lit a torch that would be passed, sometimes dimly, sometimes brightly, through the centuries to come. In her own time, her death was spoken of in hushed tones, a wound on the conscience of the city. The Christians who had supported Cyril could not deny the savagery, and those who loved Hypatia struggled to understand how a civilization could destroy its brightest light. Yet as years turned to decades, the details of her life blurred, and what remained was not so much history as legend. In the centuries of the Middle Ages, her name lingered at the edges of chronicles. The Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus had preserved the story with a tone of regret, admitting the horror of her murder, and it was through his account that future generations knew she had existed at all. But for the most part, the medieval world preferred to forget. The age of monasteries and cathedrals did not celebrate women philosophers, and the tale of Hypatia was too dangerous, too unsettling, too filled with contradictions. She was remembered but as a ghost, a half-forgotten figure whispered in the margins of manuscripts. And yet, knowledge is stubborn. Hypatia's commentaries on mathematics, her preservation of Euclid, Diophantus, and Ptolemy traveled further than her name. Through translations into Arabic, her intellectual fingerprints slipped quietly into the Islamic Golden Age, where scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba studied the very texts she had worked on. Algebra, astronomy, and geometry all bore traces of her hand. Though the world might have forgotten the woman, it had not forgotten her mind. By the time the Renaissance dawned in Europe, the hunger for lost wisdom revived interest in Hypatia. Humanists, searching ancient texts for inspiration, encountered her name and her story. They were captivated. Here was a woman who had dared to live as a philosopher, who had shone like a star in a darkening sky, only to be torn apart by fanaticism. To the Renaissance imagination, she became a tragic heroine, a symbol of the very struggle they themselves faced as they sought to restore reason and beauty in a world still bound by superstition. Artists painted her as a serene teacher, robed in dignity, surrounded by students. Writers composed plays and poems about her, often embellishing her beauty and martyrdom. To them, Hypatia was no longer just a mathematician, she was a martyr of philosophy, a victim of ignorance, a warning against allowing zealotry to strangle the pursuit of truth. Her actual writings may have been mostly lost, but her image was resurrected, sculpted into something larger than life. The Enlightenment carried her legend even further. In an age when thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot wielded reason as a weapon against dogma, Hypatia's story became an arsenal. Voltaire, in particular, invoked her as proof of the dangers of religious fanaticism. To him, she was not merely a philosopher, but the martyr of rational thought itself. Her murder was framed as evidence that superstition and tyranny, left unchecked, would always destroy what was most noble in humanity. To Enlightenment thinkers, she was a beacon, her death, not a defeat, but a rallying cry for reason. The 19th century gave her yet another life. In the age of Romanticism, she was painted with even more tragic grandeur. Charles Kingsley's novel Hypatia turned her into a figure of saintly beauty and intellectual purity, her fall a melodrama of passion and politics. While far from historically accurate, his story spread her name across Europe and America, embedding her in popular imagination. For the first time, she became widely known not only among scholars but among ordinary readers, who wept at the tale of the beautiful pagan philosopher murdered by Christians. Feminists of the era also found in her a symbol. Here was proof, they said, that women could rise to the highest heights of intellect, rivaling and surpassing men. Hypatia became a patron saint of women's education, her name invoked in speeches, essays, and rallies, demanding access to universities. If she could stand at the front of a classroom in the 5th century, why could not women do the same in the 19th? Her blood shed on the stones of Alexandria became a banner carried into the fight for equality. In the 20th century, historians revisited her with a more critical eye. They sought to separate myth from fact, to strip away the layers of poetry and propaganda that had gathered around her name. They studied the fragments of her writings, the testimonies of ancient chroniclers, the cultural context of her time. What emerged was not the romantic saint of Kingsley, nor the pagan sorceress of her enemies, but something more complex. A real woman, brilliant, courageous, and tragically vulnerable in a world at war with itself. Films and novels continued to bring her story to life, each adapting her to the needs of the age. In the modern era, she became an icon of secularism, science, and the struggle against oppression. The film Agora introduced her to a global audience, dramatizing her death and presenting her as the last defender of reason against the rising tide of fanaticism. Though the film took liberties, it reignited debates about the relationship between science and religion, reason and faith, freedom and power. Today, her name lives in classrooms, in feminist movements, in discussions of science and philosophy. She is remembered as the first great female mathematician known to history, a pioneer who defied the limitations of her gender and paid the ultimate price for her courage. Her story reminds us that knowledge is never safe, that every age faces its own mobs and zealots, and that the defense of wisdom requires not only intellect, but also bravery. And so Hypatia walks with us still. Through the centuries, her figure has changed. Philosopher, sorceress, martyr, heroine, but her essence endures. She is the voice that whispers in every lecture hall, the shadow that lingers in every debate between reason and belief, the flame that flickers wherever truth is threatened. Her death was a tragedy, but her life was a triumph, and her legacy is a challenge. Will we, unlike Alexandria, choose to protect our brightest minds, or will we again let fear silence them? The classroom was alive with the hum of voices before Hypatia arrived. Young men leaned across marble benches, their wax tablets ready, the smell of ink and papyrus heavy in the air. Some were sons of Roman officials in crisp white tunics, others Greek scholars wrapped in plain cloaks, and still others Christian students wearing the simple dress of the devout. They came from every corner of the empire, Athens, Cyrene, Antioch, even distant Gaul, drawn by the fame of a woman whose wisdom defied convention. Then the sound of footsteps echoed through the colonnade. Hypatia entered, her cloak draped over one shoulder, her hair gathered loosely, her gaze calm and commanding. The chatter ceased instantly, as though the very air had bowed before her. She carried no scrolls, no pomp, only a small stylus and the authority of her mind. "Today," she began, her voice carrying across the courtyard, "we will speak not of what is seen, but of what governs the scene. Geometry is not lines in sand, it is the shadow of truth. Let us ask, what is perfection? Does it exist in the world, or only in the mind?" A student raised his hand, young, eager, the son of a Roman magistrate. "Lady Hypatia, if perfection exists only in the mind, does that not mean it is less real than the stone beneath our feet?" She smiled faintly, tracing a circle in the dust with her stylus. "This stone will crumble, this circle will fade with the wind, but the idea of a circle perfect, unbroken, eternal, that cannot die, it lives wherever thought exists. Which, then, is more real, that which perishes or that which endures?" The boy's brow furrowed as others leaned forward, the spark of realization dawning. Another student, this one a Christian youth in simple robes, spoke hesitantly. "But if ideas are eternal, Lady Hypatia, are they not in the mind of God?" Hypatia paused, her gaze thoughtful. "Perhaps, or perhaps they are the very language through which the divine speaks. Numbers, geometry, the harmony of the spheres, they are not against faith, but above it. They are bridges, not barriers. Walk them, and you approach truth." A murmur ran through the students, half awe, half unease. In a city divided by faith, such words could be dangerous, yet in her voice they carried no defiance, only clarity. To sit in her presence was to believe that wisdom was possible, that truth could be touched, if only for a moment. After class, students lingered in the courtyard, speaking in hushed voices. Synesius of Cyrene, tall and sharp-eyed, lingered longer than most. He was one of her brightest pupils, destined one day to become a bishop, though he could not yet imagine it. "Lady Hypatia," he said quietly, Your words today, they speak to the very soul. But do you not fear the city will turn against you? The Bishop Cyril gains power. Already whispers paint you as a danger. Hypatia met his gaze, calm but unwavering. Fear belongs to those who live in shadows. We live in light. If reason is dangerous, then truth itself is dangerous. And if truth is dangerous, then what is left for humanity? Synesius bowed his head, torn between admiration and concern. He would carry her words into his future, into the church itself, though he would never escape the memory of the woman who had guided him. Outside the classroom, Alexandria bustled with its contradictions. Merchants shouted prices in the marketplace, selling figs, olives, spices, and parchment. Sailors shouted as they unloaded goods from India and Nubia. Priests led processions, their chants clashing in the streets as Jews, Christians, and pagans all proclaimed their truths. Statues of Greek gods stood beside Christian crosses, the old world and the new colliding in every corner. In such a city, Hypatia's presence was both natural and impossible. A woman philosopher walking openly, teaching men, speaking of eternal truths. At home, her evenings were filled with the quiet discipline of study. Oil lamps flickered, casting golden halos on parchment. Scrolls lay unfurled, filled with equations and diagrams. Beside her, instruments rested astrolabes polished to a bronze gleam, compasses sharp as daggers, charts of the stars annotated with her neat, steady hand. She traced calculations, adjusted numbers, corrected errors left by ancient scribes. To her, these were not idle exercises, but acts of devotion, a way of touching the eternal order woven into the universe. Sometimes her father, Theon, still joined her, though his years were waning. He watched with pride as his daughter surpassed even his skill, her mind racing ahead into realms he could only glimpse. "You are the future," he told her once, his voice thick with age. "I preserved what I could, but you carry it further. Do not let them silence you." She nodded, though she knew already how fragile knowledge was. Empires crumbled, scrolls burned, mobs rioted, but ideas could survive if carried in enough minds. She taught not only for her own sake, but to plant seeds in her students, seeds that would endure even if Alexandria fell. And fall it would. Outside her quiet sanctuary, tensions sharpened. Cyril's followers grew bolder, their sermons more pointed, their accusations more venomous. Orestes, the governor, leaned on her more heavily, seeking advice in his struggles against the bishop. Each time they met, their conversations carried the weight of politics as much as philosophy. "Hypatia," Orestes confided one evening, his brow furrowed, "the city tears itself apart. Jews against Christians, Christians against pagans, all against me. And yet they say it is you who stirs unrest, that I listen more to a woman than to the Bishop of Alexandria. They call you a sorceress." She regarded him steadily, her eyes sharp as steel. "And do you believe it?" Orestes shook his head. "I believe you are the only reason I have not drowned in this madness. But reason does not move crowds. Fear does, and they fear you." "Then let them," she said quietly. "Fear is the weapon of the ignorant. Reason is the weapon of the wise. So long as you stand, the city may yet be saved." But Orestes was weary, and in his heart he feared what she would not admit aloud, that reason alone could not withstand the tide. The spring air carried dust from the harbor and the smell of burning incense from temples and churches alike. Alexandria's streets were louder, harsher. Sermons spilled from the steps of Christian basilicas, condemning pagans and Jews with equal fury. Pagan priests clung desperately to their rituals, chanting louder as if their voices could drown out the tide. The markets, once alive with laughter, hummed with tension, and always, in the whispers of the crowd, Hypatia's name surfaced like a curse and a prayer. In her classroom, she sought to shield her students from the madness outside. On that day, she drew a circle with her stylus on the smooth board before her students. "The circle is eternal," she said. "No beginning, no end. In its perfection we glimpse truth, a truth that outlives us. What happens in these streets, what happens to kingdoms and to rulers, it is dust. But truth is not dust. It endures." A student, his face pale with worry, raised his hand. "Lady Hypatia, what if truth itself is destroyed? What if men burn it as they burn temples and books?" She looked at him steadily, her eyes calm, her voice unwavering. "Truth cannot be burned. Scrolls can be lost, voices silenced, bodies broken, but truth, lives wherever one mind recalls it, wherever one soul chooses reason over fear. If even one among you carries it forward, the mob has failed." Her words struck her students like arrows. Some nodded, filled with resolve. Others looked away, too young, too frightened to believe. But all of them felt the weight of her conviction, the gravity of her calm in the face of a city unraveling. Later, Synesius returned to speak with her privately. He had been ordained as Bishop of Ptolemy, but still considered himself her disciple. He found her at home, oil lamps flickering around scrolls and instruments. "Teacher," he said, bowing his head, "they speak of you in the churches, not with admiration, but with hatred. Cyril grows bolder, and the Parabolani roam like wolves. I fear for you." "Fear for Alexandria?" she replied. "Fear for the souls that would destroy what they cannot understand. I am only one woman, but philosophy belongs to eternity. If they destroy me, they destroy nothing." "Yet you are its voice," Synesius urged. "Without you, who will guide them?" Hypatia smiled faintly. "Then you must, Synesius, you and all my students. Carry the torch. That is why I teach, not so that my voice endures, but so that reason endures." Synesius fell silent, torn between faith and loyalty, between his role as bishop and his love for the woman who had shaped his mind. He left that evening with her words heavy upon him, words that would haunt him long after she was gone. Outside her home, the hostility grew more visible. Graffiti appeared on walls, symbols condemning her as a witch. Crowds muttered as she passed in her chariot, some spitting at her wheels, others bowing their heads in shame or admiration. Children, once eager to follow her, were now pulled back by fearful mothers. The city was changing, and not for the better. One morning, as she prepared for her lecture, a group of her younger students pleaded with her. "Do not go out today, Lady Hypatia," one begged. "The streets are dangerous. We have heard them speaking. They plan something against you." Hypatia adjusted her cloak with serene composure. If philosophy hides when threatened, then philosophy is already defeated. We must walk openly in the light, even if the light blinds those who hate it. "But teacher," another said, tears welling in his eyes, "what if they—" She placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "Then remember what I taught you. Remember the harmony of the spheres, the perfection of numbers, the truth of reason. If I fall, you must not." The students said no more. Some followed her silently, others turned away, unable to bear the thought. But she continued, her chariot rattling through streets that buzzed with tension, her figure a solitary flame walking into a gathering storm. At the same time, in the halls of the bishop's residence, the Parabolani were gathering. Harsh voices spoke of sorcery, of corruption, of danger to the faith. "She is the reason Orestes resists," they said. "She is the reason the city will not bend to God's will. Until she is gone, there will be no peace." Their fists clenched, their eyes wild, Cyril himself remained silent, offering neither blessing nor restraint, his silence a seed that bloomed into violence. The city was ready, the mob was waiting, and Hypatia, calm as ever, continued to ride toward her fate. The morning was bright, almost cruelly so, a blue so flawless it seemed painted by a god who had never known hatred. Hypatia's chariot rolled from the shaded courtyard into the avenues where the city's pulse beat loudest. Fishmongers called out prices at the harbor. A priest lifted incense before an icon. A vendor of papyrus sang a half-melody about good ink at a fairer cost. It was, for a few breaths, an ordinary day. Then the ordinary split. The watchers peeled from shadow like threads pulled from a tapestry. A handful at first, eyes fixed, jaws set, then more, gathering with the irresistible logic of a storm. They did not run, they converged. Hypatia's driver faltered, reined the horse, looked wildly for a path through, found none. She stood in the chariot, her philosopher's cloak falling in quiet folds, and met the day with unblinking calm. "Lady," someone whispered behind her, one of her younger pupils who had trailed her as far as he dared, "please." She did not turn. "Remember the circle," she said softly, whether to him, to herself, or to the city, no one could say. A voice rose from the crowd, already roughened by certainty. "The witch who blinds the governor." Another. "She casts lots against God." Another. "End the scandal." Words did what iron cannot. They unfastened hesitation. The first hands reached the chariot rail. A shove, a lurch, a cry from the horse. Hypatia steadied herself with a palm on the worn wood, then stepped down of her own accord, as if to deny them the theater of her fall. "Stand aside," she said, not a plea, not a command, but a statement that assumed the sovereignty of reason. It shattered on their armor of fervor. They formed a ring. The parabalani, robes dark, faces unguarded, breath quick with the intoxication of righteousness, pressed inward. Someone tore the reins away. Someone else seized the axle. Someone struck the wheel so that it rattled out a discordant note that would burrow into the memory of those who heard it. A woman at a window clapped a hand to her mouth. A seller of figs lowered his basket to the stones and, finding his fingers trembling, left it there. "Take her to the church," a voice said, clear, cold, clerical in its certainty. Not a blessing, not a law, merely direction. It was enough. They drew her forward. No chains, no soldiers, only hands, too many to count. She walked when they pulled, not resisting, not lending them the spectacle of struggle. A child, lifted by his father to see, would later say he had never witnessed a face more composed. An old porter would swear that the silence that surrounded her made him think of harbors at midnight, when even waves hold their breath. Through the market, across the square, beneath the shadow of toppled statues, whose gods no longer held jurisdiction, into the narthex, where lamp smoke curled like unanswered questions. Inside the cool dimness, the air changed. Outside had been public coins, clinking, gulls crying, sandals scuffing noise with edges. Here sound was round, solemn. It gathered at the vaults and returned as echo. The men who had been loud in the street grew louder still to drown the acoustic of sanctity that seemed even now to accuse them. In that uneasy choir of shouted oaths and clattering footsteps, Hypatia's own breathing was the only rhythm that did not waver. Someone thrust a shard into a fist. Another spread accusations like oil, so they would catch with the first spark. The nearest faces were flushed not with heat, but with the exhilaration of being many, and therefore certain. Hypatia looked from one to another as if trying to locate a student behind each mask. She found none. "If you believe I have erred," she said, her voice neither high nor low, simply placed, the way a mason places the first stone, "then bring argument. Let us test it." Argument, which had been her armor all her life, lay at their feet like a broken shield they could not recognize. The first hand moved. The first shard sang its brief, ugly note. A gasp leapt to the rafters. And then the pattern terrible, mindless, took over, the way locusts do not choose a field, but become a field simply by arriving. She tried once more, not to save herself, but to save them, as teachers do even at the end. "Look," she said, and lifted a palm that had drawn 1,000 perfect circles. "What you destroy, you must one day rebuild." It was not a curse. It was a law as clean as Euclid's. In the nave, a lamp guttered, flared, steadied. Outside, the harbor went on, unloading its cargo, as if nothing in the world had changed, though everything had. When it was over, noise retreated into the stone, and a hush gathered with the density of a held breath. The men who had been many became individuals again. They discovered their hands. They discovered the smell of oil and copper and something they could not name. They looked at one another with the fragile relief of conspirators who realized the deed cannot be undone and therefore must be sanctified by certainty. No one offered a prayer. They took what was left to the street because mobs, like fires, need air. The city watched. Some wept, some knelt, some made the quick practical calculations by which human beings remain alive in dangerous times. A boy reached for a fallen scrap of her cloak and hid it under his tunic as if a relic might anchor him to a saner geometry. By twilight, the last smoke had risen and thinned and gone to join the high wind that polished the evening star. Alexandria resumed its clatter, but a seam had opened in the world. Orestes received the news not as information but as the collapse of a structure he had leaned on without knowing its full weight. He dismissed courtiers with an impatient wave and closed his eyes to a brightness that felt like fever. In that private darkness, the city's map rearranged itself. Streets that had been avenues of law became corridors of rumor. Buildings became opinions. The sea withdrew a little, as if in horror. When he rose, it was to a room colder, not because the lamps had gone out, but because the idea of Alexandria had. Cyril said little. He did not need to explain silence to men who preferred it. His followers found in restraint the flattery of shared understanding. The city's new equilibrium, heavy, off-center, but balanced enough to endure, settled over the markets, the baths, the lecture halls that would not hear her voice again. The Parabolani drifted, still in pairs, their steps unhurried now, their hands open and empty. Her students gathered in a courtyard that remembered her tread. They brought nothing ceremonial, nothing official, only what they had. Wax tablets with half-drawn conics, a compass, a repaired astrolabe, a marginal note in the careful hand that had corrected a copied demonstration of Book X. One by one, they said her name as if names could anchor ships, and then fell into the work she had taught them to love. They drew a circle. They inscribed a triangle. They proved a lemma. No one needed proved, precisely to declare that proof had not perished. Synesius lifted his eyes and, for the first time as a bishop, prayed not for victory or vengeance, but for the grace to remember what a line is, the shortest distance between 2 points, the surest path between confusion and clarity. The city did not repent. Cities rarely do. But in the private geographies of the ordinary, the weaver who measured warp against weft, the scribe who spaced his letters by knuckle width, the navigator who took a star's altitude there remained the stubborn fact of proportion, ratio, number. These refused to align with hatred. They waited, austerely patient, in the ledgers of merchants and the arches of aqueducts and the songs that resolved to a fifth. And because they waited, the world did not collapse, only listed. Years later, a youth in a different city unrolled a copied text of Diophantus and found a commentary note written in a hand long since turned to dust. He did not know the name behind the gloss, only that a difficulty he had thought his alone was met there with an elegance that made his face heat with gratitude. He copied the note forward. Another century, and a scholar in Arabic read a cleaner proof of a lunar inequality and traced in it a mind that did not flinch from complexity. He did not know he was hearing Hypatia, and it did not matter. The argument was sound, the curve closed. Centuries later still, a printer in Venice set type for Euclid and took a moment, only a moment, to admire the calm authority with which the propositions lay upon the page. Somewhere, in the white space that allowed the eye to rest, a woman rode her chariot forever through a city that could not keep her and could not quite let her go. And in our own age, noisy, ingenious, certain of little for long, Her name returns whenever the world forgets itself. A classroom says it. A march says it. A solitary reader turning a page late at night says it under the breath and feels less alone. She has become what geometry always promised, an invariant. Not an idol. Idols demand what they cannot deserve, but a figure stable under transformation, recognizable through distortions, surviving translation. Think of the circle, she would say, if she could speak again. It is there in the sun that warmed the stones of the church, in the moon that watched the harbor, in the wheel of her chariot, in the iris that widened when a first proof was understood. You can mar the surface, you cannot abolish the form, you can shatter the instrument, you cannot erase the relation it once measured, you can burn a body, you cannot set fire to the axiom that outlives you. This, then, is the remainder that the mob, who understood subtraction but not remainder, failed to calculate, that a life given to truth enters the ledger on a different line. Alexandria balanced its books by nightfall and pretended the accounts were closed. But a debt remained, accruing, silently paid forward by students who would teach students who would teach the world to ask better questions, by women who would walk into rooms that had not imagined them and sit down at the table without asking leave, by mathematicians who would press through difficulty until the proof stood on its own legs and bowed to no one. Call her the greatest mathematician of her age if you like. The title fits well enough. Call her philosopher, astronomer, teacher, martyr of reason. Each name touches a chord of the larger music. But if you must choose one, choose this. Witness. She witnessed that the mind is free even when the body is surrounded, that clarity is a form of courage, that the right word placed exactly is a structure more enduring than stone. She witnessed that truth, like a circle, returns. And if you listen past the noise of factions, beyond the syntax of outrage, you can hear the chariot on the stones again, the quiet cadence of hooves, the hinge of a wheel that turns because circles cannot do otherwise. You can hear a voice, level and exact, asking for argument and offering it in return. You can see a hand draw what cannot be undrawn. In that sound, that sentence, that gesture, the world remembers how to steady itself. We say her name to locate ourselves on that map, Hypatia,